I'm looking around. I think I've seen a lot of you throughout this day, which is excellent. Thank you so much for being here with us today for the first day of the 38th Annual Legislative Conference. And we are very happy to be putting on this forum and to have the excellent panel of presenters that we have present, as well as you to engage in a very, very important discussion. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Allow me to introduce to you our moderator for this session. I'm sure you know him well. He is a cable news commentator. You've seen him on CNN and elsewhere. He is also the president of New Future Communication, Mr. Jamal Simmons.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. This is an honor to be on this panel with this group of folks. Everyone here is very well renowned. I'm not going to go through all the names here. I'll ask for you to take a look inside your programs, and you'll see each one of their very long and honorable careers as you go through. You know, we're looking here at African American leadership, and obviously, just to set the tone, we all are living through what is arguably the most tremendous experience in African American politics that any of us have ever seen. Starting a year ago, if you went back a year ago and you thought about what was happening on the national scene, you would have said, okay, so next year we'll have a campaign with two people in it. One of them will be either Rudy Giuliani or Mitt Romney, and the other one would be Hillary Clinton, right? Instead, though, what we had was we had really a big movement for change. A lot of people, you know, you've heard that word now 50,000 times if you watch any of the television news. A lot of people have been talking about this word change. And to be fair since this is a nonpartisan forum, to be fair, of the candidates who are running for president, you could argue that both parties chose a candidate that most represented change in their party. Now, I would argue that John McCain is not really change, but among Republicans, he was somebody that Republicans maybe thought would come to Washington if he got elected and shake things up, more so than Mitt Romney or Rudy Giuliani or Fred Thompson or any of that other gang. On the Democratic side, it was clear that Barack Obama was running on that same message of change. Obviously, he talked about it a lot. And if you looked at what his opponents were doing, take an interesting experiment. Go back through Yahoo News or go back through Google Photos and look at the campaign rallies of the other candidates and look at Barack Obama's campaign rallies from last year all the way through this year. You will see an amazing consistency in the signage and slogans that were used throughout both of those campaigns. I think Senator Clinton, who ran a great campaign, she probably had 4 or 5 different slogans. One was about experience, and one was about strength, and then she finally got around to change. And by the time she got around to change, the campaign had sort of already moved beyond the point of her being able to catch up. So this year, though, as we think about what's going on in African American politics, and many of you, I'm sure we'll hear from the panel here, we have some flare-ups. I'm going to just put them on the table, and we can talk about them today. We all remember a couple of things that maybe have been said by Reverend Jackson that didn't go over so well. We all remember a speech by Robert Johnson in South Carolina that didn't go over so well. We probably remember a speech by Andy Young in Atlanta to a small group that ended up on the internet comparing Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. That didn't go over so well. We remember a lot of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus who endorsed Senator Clinton instead of Senator Obama early on. A lot of people just couldn't get their brains around what was happening in the country. And for political reasons, I mean, some people had very real reasons about why they wanted to support one candidate or another. But what was striking to me, though, from some of the commentary the individual just mentioned, and all of whom I have great amount of respect for and have met previously, is the amazing sort of personal nature of some of what was said about Senator Obama. It was as if there was something else that was going on underneath that wasn't just about the politics. There was something very personal about the commentary. And that's maybe some of what we want to delve in today. What is it that is about this change moment? It's not just a change moment in America, but it's clearly a change moment in African American. I'll tell you one small thing before I step down. If you remember, in New Jersey, there was a gubernatorial election a couple years ago, where John Corzine won the governor's race. How many people in here, you may not know Cornell Belcher? Cornell Belcher is one of Barack Obama's pollsters. He's African American, really one of the most prominent African American pollsters in the country. He's been a pollster for the DNC. He was a pollster for John Corzine, pollster for Barack Obama. Cornell figured out in the course of his research with some of the field people in New Jersey that there actually were more African Americans who lived in non-African American majority precincts in the state of New Jersey than there were who lived in majority African American precincts in the state of New Jersey. So that meant that you could go to Newark, you could go to Trenton, you could go to places where there were huge pockets of African Americans, but there were actually more African Americans who were dispersed throughout the suburbs and the other parts of the state of New Jersey than the numbers of people that you would see when you were in Newark or in Trenton or in one of the other cities. So as a campaign, they targeted African Americans in majority white precincts in a way that hadn't really been done in democratic politics, and got people to come out and talk to them with very specific messages. And the messages that probably resonated, they used that resonated with that cohort of African Americans was going to be very different often than the messages that resonated with folks who were still living in Center City, Newark. That's happening all over the country. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. We're seeing it now in Detroit, which is the biggest pocket of votes in the state of Michigan. However, people like my cousins who have now, most of my family, who've now moved out to follow, whether it was jobs or to follow education, they now live in Oakland County, Southfield, Bloomfield Hills. You know, people make a little bit more money, sell a house, move a little further out, put their kids into better school. And you know, their interests are starting to diverge from the interests of folks who grew up where I grew up, Dexter and Davison, in the middle of the city of Detroit near Highland Park. So that is a part of, I think, this dynamic that we'll talk about when we talk about African American politics. We're an African American community. What we may be seeing is African American communities, plural, and whether or not each one of us has to represent all African American communities all the time. Maybe there are different roles for different people at different moments, but so we'll get to it. So the first, we're going to start off in our agenda with Andra Gillespie and Tyson King Meadows, who. Nope. Am I wrong? Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to start off with Ron Walters, who will give us some perspective on this, as from his perch in academia and his long history of dealing with these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin. I wrote the wrong speech. Because I know now that we're going to talk about the campaign. And I should have guessed that. But I really wanted to say something about African American leadership, because I think that's also important in sticking to the subject matter. But let me just throw this out here and get you thinking, and that is that I do not think that Barack Obama is an African American leader. That sort of conjoins the conflict, and we can have some discussion about that. But that comes from my study of African American leadership, and there's a book there that, Gary, if you hold it up, is, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The role of Vanna White.
Little advertisement there. With Professor Robert Smith of San Francisco State University. We took this seriously enough to look at 30 years of African American leadership and to begin to jot down what we thought were some very important facts concerning it. The first thing is the definition of African American leadership. It is the leadership of African American people toward the resolution of challenges they face in each era of history that leads to freedom. Jacob Gordon, in a book Black Leadership for Social Change, which is a really very good book as well. Defined African American leadership as a group reaction to their oppression in American history. Most people who look at this subject assume that the first part of the definition is that there is an African American who will be leading the group. And there's I've run across some discussion about that too. But that's in my definition, that African American leadership begins with a person, male or female, who is leading the group. Freedom from oppression. It means with the goal of achieving a full measure of individual and collective ability to function on an equal plane with other citizens in the enjoyment of citizenship rights, consumer rights, and other kinds of rights and privileges, all the way to spiritual dimension of freedom. What I mean by that is that you can have a lot of material stuff, but unless your head acknowledges it, it means that you still are not quite free. So the question is, does the meaning of freedom change in each era, or must it be redefined? Because if we're going to talk about leadership, it seems to me that leadership is the leadership of people toward freedom. It means, what is freedom, and does it change in each era? Does it have a generational tag on it, or is there something consistent about it? Cornel West has observed that the individuals who best represented the group were often the black leaders who arose, and I'm quoting, under conditions of crisis and emergency, to voice the oppression of black people and to demand redress of that condition, unquote. And this has been true from Frederick Douglass all the way down to Reverend Jackson and Sharpton and so forth. They had to manifest a keen sense of courage to confront the challenges, organizing capability, personal skills, oratory, intelligence, vision, and many other characteristics. So the judgment of whether a change, which there may well be in this generation, the judgment of whether or not that change is positive may be determined on whether it helps to accomplish the goal of delivering black people from the oppression they face in any era of history to the condition of freedom. Very often, we confuse the goals of change with the methods of change. Gordon says that generally the goals of black freedom and liberation are the same, but the methods are different. So different sometimes that takes on a substantive characteristics of its own. The militants and the moderates and the Uncle Toms and all the ways in which we have characterized leadership, a lot of that has to do with different methodologies. But what I'm saying is that sometimes the methods are so substantive that they take on a characteristic of their own. I believe that that may be where we are today, discussing and assessing strategies and methodologies rather than the goal of liberation, arguing over whether the tactics and strategies that we have mounted in a former age are relevant to this age as well. And although many criticize the methods of militant black leaders who are the bell ringers of oppression because they have always made us, even black people, uncomfortable, the charge is that the tactics and strategies they use may be out of date or even inappropriate to this era. That is a charge that deserves serious consideration. Reading the popular literature, I come to that because reading the popular literature today on black leadership, it is fraught with condemnation and criticism, as though black leaders had the power to change the reality of black people all by themselves. In fact, our power is and has been marginal. It is also specialized, because as a people without economic resources, we have had to depend upon people power, and therefore uniquely upon political mobilization. Therefore, our propensity to mobilize and influence the political system, we have placed great stock in that. And we've placed great stock in the leaders who could help us to effect that. So I would suggest that leadership has some structural dimensions. And this structure gives an indication also of the functional basis of black leadership. The first job of an African American leader is to deal with his or her group. That is to administer the relationships within that particular group. And we have a range of leaders, some elected, some not elected, but we have a very rich bouquet of leadership in the black community whose basic job is to administer the affairs of the various cultural, social, and professional organizations in that community. But others emerge as consensus leaders who have not been selected or elected. And they often, sometimes have more power than many of those who are elected, primarily because they take on some of the toughest challenges. And so the nature of the challenge has a lot to do with the characteristic of leadership in our community. And the Frederick Douglasses and these people who have taken on the toughest, the strongest challenges are the ones that we look back upon in history and we call them some of our greatest leaders. Our leadership has a second responsibility, and that is to represent our group in the larger society. That's where the power is. That's where the resources are. And therefore, one of the tasks is to attempt to influence those political institutions and structures in order to return that power to our own community. The role of whites, therefore, in determining black leaders sometimes is very fundamental. And there's a lot of criticism about that because blacks have to interface with largely white-dominated institutions. And they have an inordinate role, therefore, in legitimizing African-American leaders. Black political participation, we've sort of drifted into that, is an institution at every level of government. And the question there is, can we extract out of those political institutions the things that we need as effectively and as efficiently as those individuals who have been able to bring pressure and power to bear on those institutions to deliver these things sometimes far more quickly. Now, we don't have a choice, I think, in that. We have to depend upon them both. There is a drift in this generation toward institutional leadership. It is what we have all worked for. It is what we have all wanted. And the growth of the black middle class is reflected in the Ebony surveys between 1963 and 1980. You know, the Ebony publishes that list of 100 black leaders. And when we analyze that list, it's very clear that the civil rights leaders and the religious leaders have been diminishing in terms of the consensus view of who is a black leader. And the institutional leaders have been growing in terms of their number and their strength in the Ebony surveys in this period. But I found another Ebony survey of the 30 emerging black leaders that they put out just this year. And it was very interesting to me that when one looks at that list, and these are all 30 years old and under, 30 and under, that predominantly they are in the economic and political categories. They're elected officials. They are people who are in, Fortune 500 corporations. So that there is a drift toward that kind of leadership in this generation. And I might define what we mean by new and changing and some of the other characteristics that we're using about a change in leadership. Therefore, I believe that the title of this forum should be changed. It's called Post-Civil Rights Leadership. I do not believe that we are in a post-civil rights anything. This is a civil rights era as much as the previous one was. What we don't have is the movement which defines the characteristics of that era. Let me tell you what I mean. I'm going to take 2007, 2008, and I'm not going to be long. Katrina, We've had a just-in-time leadership. Well, that, you know, that just-in-time. If we hadn't had a just-in-time leadership, we wouldn't have been able to confront a lot of what happened in Katrina. That was just now. Jena 6. For those of us who were down there marching, Gary, in Louisiana, on that bridge, there were some just-in-time leaders down there, not very many institutional leaders down there, raising that question. Son Bell, killed, fired 48 bullets into him. Well, there was a just-in-time leader who stood on the Brooklyn Bridge and stopped traffic to try to bring that to public attention. I didn't see very many institutional leaders there. Don Imus, who disgraced our women. I didn't see very many institutional leaders in the front of the line. You see where I'm going. Nooses showing up everywhere. It seems to me that we are still in a civil rights era. 30,000 employment discrimination complaints, the EEOC data, check it out, last year alone. We are still in a civil rights era. This racism at the national level, racism at the local level is still so strong. I don't know how many of you live in Washington, D.C., but the coach of the Dunbar High School had to pull his team off the field the other night. There were so many N-words being used against his team in the middle of the game. So we are not in a post-civil rights era. And what that begs, I think, from the rest of the panelists is a description of what era are we in with respect to leadership. I think that by newer generational leadership, did we mean more emphasis upon legislation? Did we mean more emphasis upon economic? Did we mean more emphasis upon institutional administration? Just what did we mean? If we mean these things, that will be determined by the output from those institutions, much of which we do not control. We're talking about the challenges very often control our leadership. We didn't manufacture Katrina. That just arose, and we had to confront it. Black people don't control the ebb and the flow of racism either, where it emanates, what its intensity is. So I suggested in my book with Robert Smith that there is a stability of leadership. And what we must do in each era is to use all of the tactics and strategies that are appropriate to the challenge, and not to think about them as generational or simply new with respect to either the goals or the tactics or the strategies. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to change my mind from what I said earlier. I am actually going to introduce the people because I don't think we did Professor Walters any justice. He is the director of the AfricanAmerican Leadership Center, distinguished leadership scholar at the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership, and professor of government at the University of Maryland. Dr. Walters is internationally known for his expertise on the issues of African-American leadership and politics. In 1984, Dr. Walters served as deputy campaign manager for issues of the Jesse Jackson campaign for president. He had written over 100 articles and 10 books and serves as a board member of the Black Leadership Forum, the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation, and other organizations. So let's welcome him appropriately. And so next we're going to go to a case study of post-civil rights African-American leadership, or whatever era it is that the next group of panelists want to define this era as, civil rights plus, perhaps. And leading that discussion will be Andra Gillespie. And Andra is a Emory University political science professor who covers American political participation, effective campaigning, and voting behavior, African-American politics, and post-civil rights generation leadership. Dr. Gillespie has worked in the political campaign industry, observing firsthand the often nitty-gritty nature of grassroots politics. In fact, I met Andra walking around during the Harold Ford campaign in 2006. Before joining Emory in 2005, Dr. Gillespie was an analyst with the Mellman Group in Washington, a leading Democratic polling firm, while completing her dissertation at Yale University on community coordination in context, a black politics perspective on voter mobilization. And I'm going to also introduce her counterpart, Tyson King Meadows. And Mr. Meadows, Dr. Meadows, is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where he specializes in American politics, black politics, and American political institutions. Dr. King Meadows' teaching is focused on congressional politics, American government, democratization, and identity politics. His first book, Devolution and Black State Legislators, Challenges and Choices in the 21st Century, co-authored with Thomas Schaller, examines the relationship between the level of descriptive representation and the substantive representation of black interests. His next book addresses racial authenticity in congressional elections. Now, I'm very interested in this notion of racial authenticity. So let's welcome both of our leaders.
I think I'm going to have to pull up my presentation real quick. Okay. Tyson and I are going to break up our presentation. I'm going to start by providing a brief overview of the new generation of African-American elected leadership in particular, and then he's going to follow up with an interesting case study analysis that somewhat deviates from the traditional pattern that he's looking at black Republicans. I would like to start off with a quote from the McLaughlin Group. Right after Barack Obama won the Iowa caucus this year, they had a roundtable discussion on the impact of Barack Obama and his cohort on African-American politics. So I don't mimic well, so I'm not even going to try to mimic McLaughlin, but I will actually read this verbatim. McLaughlin starts off by saying, transcending race, trans-race politicians, Obama represents a new era of powerful black politicians. They are above race and beyond race. According to the American Prospect, these new leaders are not what they used to be, called race men. They argue that they don't need to concern themselves primarily with the uplift of the race. They appeal to black voters, to be sure, but to white ones as well. They don't want to be just mayors or congressmen from majority black districts. They want to be governors, senators, and presidents. Black leaders today include Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick, Washington, D.C. Mayor Adrian Fenty, former Congressman Harold Ford, Congressman Arthur Davis of Alabama. Here's how the nation describes them. They have been hailed not just as a development in black American politics, but as a repudiation of black American politics. Not just as different from Jesse Jackson, but the epitome of the anti-Jesse. Ivy League professionals, heirs to the civil rights movement who are determined to move both beyond the mood and the message of their forebears. Question: there's more to Obama's win than Obama. There is also the political evolution of black America. That's what this piece says. Is it true? So I don't have time to actually go into the argument, but the panel got into this very heated debate about whether or not Barack Obama and his cohort represents the antithesis of Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. And they pretty much agreed that that was the case, but it was very interesting to hear how they discussed why this group of men in particular, because it is almost exclusively male, is different from the previous generation of civil rights leaders. And the things that they talked about were quite interesting. So people were talking about their pedigrees, that they went to Harvard and Duke and not Howard and Morehouse. They talked about the fact that they were more moderate in their politics and that they were jam makers and not jelly shakers and all of these sorts of things. Eleanor Clift goes off on distinguishing Barack Obama because he's biracial, and by making him biracial, she was distinguishing him from the rest of the African American community. I bring this up to say that there's some really interesting things to think about when we think about sort of this new cohort of African American politics. Yes, there's a lot that's different, but there are also some elements that are going to be the same. But when people spend a lot of time talking about class differences or focusing on the telegenic types like Patrick, like Ford, like Cory Booker, like Barack Obama, you obscure sort of the wide diversity that's present in this cohort. So what I want to do today is to provide a theoretical framework with which to define and analyze this new generation of post-racial, post-civil rights African-American leadership. I'm not terribly skeptical of the idea that these folks are leaders. At a panel that I actually attended a few weeks ago at the American Political Science Association, which Professor Walters was actually a member of, there was a colleague on the panel, Clarence Lusane from American University, who suggested that if a black person is elected to office and they are leading African-American people, then by default they are African-American leaders, whether they like it or not. And I actually take that into account and actually just sort of run with that assumption. What I want to do in the next few minutes is demonstrate the diversity of the cohort, explain the origins of the various sub-cohorts very briefly. I do have a longer show, but we can't do that here today. And explain the policy implications of the election of this cohort on the advancement of a classic civil rights agenda. And by doing that, I'm going to tie it into a linked fate framework that's pretty dominant in African American politics and the study of it in political science. To start off, I want to talk about new black politics. So in all honesty, this notion of new black politics is about 45 years old. And so we have to divide new black politics accordingly. So the origin actually starts when Bayard Rustin calls for African Americans to take their franchise and move from protest to politics. So use their vote to get blacks elected to office, to create legislative coalitions with non-blacks who are sympathetic. So whether they're Latinos, whether it's the labor movement, whether it's Asian Americans, to help advance an African-American agenda. So because of this, he always had in mind that the coalition was going to be a rainbow coalition. There are what I would call three discernible phases of blacks post-civil rights black politics. So by post-civil rights black politics, I mean civil rights politics that actually sort of emanates from the passage of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. The first phase of African American leadership would include those blacks who were elected to Congress and elected to big city mayoralties in the late 60s, 1970s, and early 1980s. Oftentimes, these folks were coming directly from the movement, having served in the trenches, having marched, having been beaten, and they carried part of that confrontational style from the movement directly into City Hall or into the halls of Congress. We think about why we are here today. Part of the reason why there is a Congressional Black Caucus is because the protest style of the civil rights movement carried itself over into institutions. When these people took power, they were trailblazers, they encountered discrimination and difficulty, but they also happened to come to power during a perfect storm of deindustrialization, economic decline, recession, stagflation, and then the Reagan presidency. And so as a result of this, they were often hampered in some of their efforts to redress deep-seated problems in the African American community, such as poverty, homelessness, infant mortality, and other types of issues. So they did the best they could with what they had. And so if we look particularly at the city level, if we look at what mayors were able to do, they were able to introduce affirmative action policies, they were able to make high-profile minority appointments, and they were also able to do downtown development in terms of building buildings in the downtown corridor and other types of things. The second phase of post-civil rights black leadership would be marked by the success of the Dracialized campaigns of 1989. So in 1989, David Dinkins is elected mayor of New York City. Norm Rice is elected mayor of Seattle. You have mayors who are elected in Durham, in New Haven, Connecticut. Most importantly, Doug Wilder is elected governor of Virginia. What marks this group of black politicians from the earlier phase of black politicians is, one, they're getting elected in majority white jurisdictions. Second, they're also doubling their white support. So whereas the early phase of black politicians could count on getting no more than about 20% of the white vote in their first elections, these groups were getting close to 40%. And they were doing that because they introduced a campaign style that was called deracialization. Now, in all honesty, Charles Hamilton had coined this term more than a decade before. What it entails is de-emphasizing race and de-emphasizing racial issues in order to appeal to white voters and not making explicit racial appeals to African American votes in the hopes of being able to create a broad-based coalition. At the time that they created this strategy or actually put it into play, scholars had they had a debate about whether or not this was actually normatively the appropriate way to go about sort of getting blacks elected to office. Their big concern was that if people made the decision to not talk about race in the campaign, would they be constrained from being able to act in the interest of African Americans once elected to office? The analysis was somewhat short-lived because the careers of most of these phase 2 black politicians was relatively short-lived. So when people had progressive career ambitions and they tried to run for higher office, they were often stopped. So Doug Wilder couldn't run for president of the United States. Andrew Young couldn't become governor of Georgia. Harvey Gantt couldn't become senator from North Carolina twice. And in the case of David Dinkins, he ended up losing. That leads us to phase 3. This is the ascent of contemporary young leadership. They, unlike the previous generations, are very much marked by their generation. They tend to be born after the heyday of the civil rights movement, or if they were born before, they were too young to have been participants. So you can roughly put an age marker as people definitely born after 1960, and we can give or take about 5 years with that. They run deracialized campaigns. They have moderate politics. And one of the things that's very important about them is that they have challenged leaders in phase 1 and phase 2. So instead of waiting for people to retire, they've often taken it upon themselves to actually challenge these folks for office at the height of their political power and political careers. The assumption is because of their deracialized style and because of their ability to raise money, that they actually have the potential to amass more power than previous generations of black leadership. So these are the ones who aspire to be governor, who aspire to be senator, who aspire to be president of the United States. And because of this, scholars have actually questioned whether these politicians actually have a commitment to advancing black interests or whether they are advancing their own personal agendas. So I want to talk about the challenges in particular and where these challenges emanate from. Part of this is a technocratic reaction to things that either they don't understand or things that people think that they could do better. So oftentimes, phase 3 black politicians are responding to the systemic and strategic failures of what previous phases could not do. And what they argue is that given their credentials, given their training, they're in a better position to actually be able to realize certain goals in the African American community. Now, the tone in which they take to actually challenge black leaders could be viewed as problematic and disrespectful, but that's the position from which they're coming from. The question that we should ask is whether or not these are fair metrics by which to judge their elders. The failures were systemic failures. These weren't necessarily the personal failings of phase 1 and phase 2 black leadership. And then the question sort of becomes, especially given the age of this generation, how can this new generation actually guarantee that they can produce better results on these systemic issues? Some of these folks start challenging people when they're 31 and 32 and fresh out of law school. So how do we know that they're actually in a better position to be able to challenge and actually do a better job once in office? So in figuring out how to assess phase 3, I think we need actually a more expansive taxonomy than the one that we've used before. Prior theories of leadership suggest that we should base leadership on the leader's position or relationship with the black and the white community. It ends up leading to a linear left-right continuum based on whether or not someone is militant or whether they're moderate. Instead, what I want to do is propose a 3-dimensional view of black leadership that takes into account crossover appeal, but also takes into account a person's progressive ambitions and their connections to the black establishment. When we do that, we end up, and I'm sorry to have to go through this so quickly, we end up with 8 basic types, but I'm going to condense it to 3 for the sake of clarity. Those whose basic characteristic is dominated by their strong credentials, those whose basic characteristics are their strong connections to the black establishment, and those whose dominant characteristic are their street credentials. Let me talk about those with the strong credentials first. There are 2 types. I call them the Ivy League upstarts and the local kids made good. They include people who we're very familiar with, people like Barack Obama, Cory Booker, Archer Davis, and Adrian Fenty. These folks have a very high crossover appeal. They have they're very moderate, and they have very few ties to the black establishment. So typically, in popular discussions, when we're talking about new black leadership, this is the group that they're talking about most of the time. Because they have weak ties to the black establishment, that ends up sort of lending itself to those discussions about who's black enough to lead and other types of things. These are the ones who are more likely to use a systemic failure in their jurisdiction to launch their own political careers. If we want to talk about the people who have strong ties to the black establishment, this is actually sort of the massive young black leadership. If we look at people like Harold Ford Jr., Kendrick Meek, Jesse Jackson Jr., these are people who use their family connections to help launch their political careers. They're less likely to challenge an elder for power because they're succeeding their parents, and so they don't challenge their parents retire, and then they take their seats. And so because of that, you don't hear or see the same types of sort of authentic blackness debates being used against them. Now, sort of the family name can be a blessing, but the family name could also be a curse, depending on how you want to use it. So if an elder has been controversial, that could be used against you. If an elder sort of still has a lot of political influence, if you want to do something different and your mother or father is telling you strategically that that's not what you should be doing, you have a tension in terms of being able to define yourself. And so we have very different groups sort of within this group of dynastic heirs. Harold Ford is very different from Jesse Jackson Jr., is very different from Kwame Kilpatrick. We've got to acknowledge that. Finally, I want to talk briefly about those whose dominant characteristic are their high levels of street credibility. So these are people who are not going to have high crossover appeal, and their ties to the black establishment are going to be tenuous in that they're not going to have connections to black leaders in particular. That doesn't mean that they're disconnected from African American communities. It's been, at the national level, it's been really difficult for people to get elected, but this year we've seen congressional challenges by people who fit this characteristic. People like Kevin Powell in Brooklyn or Markell Hutchins in Atlanta. These are people who emerge because they see a political opportunity. In Adolphus Towns, sort of having had some very steep electoral challenges in recent cycles, or in Markell Hutchins' case, the shooting of a 92-year-old woman by the police in Atlanta. And they use those instances to try to launch their political careers. Because they tend to be very resource poor, it's unlikely that these people are going to be incredibly successful in getting elected, but I never say never. So 2 years ago, I would have said that I would have never seen somebody emerge in this pattern, and lo and behold, here we are today. So this is something that definitely warrants further study. We have to ask the question of whether or not this group of black leadership actually advances black interests. So if people are going to adopt the deracialized stance, does that actually mean that they are implicitly saying that we're going to pull racial issues off the table if we get elected? That's a question that needs to be raised constantly and constantly needs to be studied. For some of the people who have been most prominent and sort of emerging, they've emerged within the last 5 years, so the record is still kind of being developed, and it's hard for us to say at this point. So basically, if there is this anxiety, if there is this fear that deracialized black candidates are not going to be in a position to actually advocate for African American interests once in office, then scholars like me and Professor Walters and Professor King Meadows actually look for other clues to try to figure out these potential candidates' fealty to the African American community. And where we can't find those ties to the establishment, where we can't find those loyalties, that ends up raising the cause for concern. And so ultimately, in popular parlance, this ends up leading to this discussion of whether or not somebody has linked fate, or whether or not somebody is black enough. And so saying somebody is black enough or not black enough to be an African American leader is really a crude way of saying that a person doesn't have linked fate. And Michael Dawson in 1994 developed this notion of the black utility heuristic to explain why middle-class blacks supported policies that countered their economic interests. And so what it basically says is that blacks who believe that what happens to other blacks affects them are more likely to behave differently than blacks who don't share this notion or this idea. What people are still asking about this cohort of young African American leaders is whether or not they have linked fate, and whether or not that actually manifests themselves in their campaign styles and in their policy preferences. So when we're thinking about this, the socio-demographic profile of this cohort, having been raised in integrated environments, having gone to integrated schools, and been socialized in traditional mainstream institutions, it actually raises the question of, one, whether or not you have linked fate, and then two, if you have linked fate, whether or not you're actually naive in terms of dealing with the larger institutional structure. So Roland Martin interviewed Professor Walters in 2003, and Professor Walters gave this great quote. He says that the white power structure would rather supplant the old guard with a far more accommodating leadership. They're going to have to pit them against the so-called old leadership because they've been threatened by the interest and power of the black leadership who really have the influence and control of black people. And so that's the question that we are just struggling to answer right now. I have a couple of predictions for the cohort and a bit of advice as well. So one, the diversity of the cohort suggests that the McLaughlin group's hope that the new generation will completely supplant the old generation of leadership is unfounded. There's no way that that's going to happen. So if Charles Rangel dies, if Jesse Jackson dies, if Al Sharpton dies, there are going to be challenges, and this debate is going to perpetuate itself even within the generation because not everybody has the same ideological stance or the same perspective on what's going on. We also have to take into account that we could be in a position where we really are seeing a split in an African American agenda based on class. Michael Dawson predicted that if racism persisted, but we started to see increasing class inequality within the African American community, what we could see is the creation of two black Americas, two black political agendas based on class. And I think the emergence of this third phase of African American leadership only heightens that type of divide that we could potentially see happening. We do have to acknowledge, though, that the increased diversity in the United States actually provides advantages to deracialized candidates. And nobody's ever said that that wasn't the case or that it wasn't strategic to be deracialized. We're just saying that there are normative consequences for that, and those need to be examined. So my questions for the cohort are, does the change in style actually provide a change in substantive policy? Professor Walters has already addressed that, so I won't add anything else to that. I do want to ask the question as to why female leaders have been absent or lagging in this discussion. So if we look at the election of Harold Ford and Jesse Jackson Jr. in 1996, it was a decade before another young black woman gets elected to Congress. So there are three now, but this is a problem, and we have to ask, why are we perpetuating the same type of sexism today? And then the question we have to ask is, what happens when phase 4 arises? So what happens when all of a sudden Barack Obama's the crotchety old guy and you've got another 20-year-old who's trying to take his place? How is phase 3 going to react? Is this about ego, or are we really talking about substance? The advice for everyone I want to give in conclusion is, one, I think that part of the debate and part of the tone has been very disrespectful on both sides. So I want to bring everybody back to a politics of respect. And so I'd like to urge everyone to not fear policy innovation and new political alliances. But for those who are actually going to put these things forward, you've got to be able to admit when you're wrong. So if you have an idea and you experiment and it's wrong, you've got to retreat from it and not stick to your guns. You also have to be careful of tone. There is still an imperative, a normative imperative, I would say, to respect elders and actually learn from institutional knowledge and memory, and that's not always happening between the phase 3 leaders and some of their forebears. And I think it's also important that phase 3 leaders also learn to be wary of some of their so-called friends, because some of their so-called friends have agendas and you can't trust everybody all the time. I would, before as I end, like to sort of hawk a book that Tyson and I are both contributing to. I'm the editor of a book called Who's Black Politics? Cases in Post-Racial Leadership. So it'll be coming out in the spring, and in that book we're going to be discussing these issues in greater detail. So with that, thank you very much.
How are we doing? I'm going to depart a little bit from what Andra was talking about and try to expand some of the discussion using the 2006 Senate race between Kwesi Mfume, Ben Cardin, and eventually Republican Michael Steele. So the 2006 campaign for Maryland's open Senate seat challenged convention, providing an excellent counterfactual to some of these discussions on deracialization. On one side was a conservative one-term Republican Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele, the state's first black to win statewide elected office in 2002. On the other side, fighting for the Democratic primary win were, among others, 10-year Democratic U.S. House incumbent Representative Ben Cardin, who's now the senator, in a tight contest against 5-term Democratic U.S. House Representative and former National NAACP President Kwesi Mfume. There were historical, attitudinal, and pragmatic reasons for blacks not to support Steele, but they did. Both Mfume and Steele defied expectations. Both defied expectations by running from and on race, and Steele specifically defied the odds by making the 2006 Senate contest competitive in a decidedly blue state and by picking up 25% of the black vote, despite high national anti-Republican sentiment. So that's sort of the case we're going to talk about today, and how we're going to get there is we're going to talk about sort of race, representation, and expectation. And so what you see here is Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. That was an ad that gained prominence in 2006 and gained additional prominence in Denver in 2008. There you see the Emerge cover depicting Clarence Thomas as a lawn jockey, Not Your Daddy's Democrats, Howard Ford, and then sort of the racialized iconography connecting sort of black liberation theology with Senator Barack Obama. And then October 2005, that's actually a depiction of Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele in blackface. And so we're going to talk about how we got there to sort of these expectations about how black leadership should manifest itself. So we start with this question: how do we know the representation of black interests when we see it? So Andra talked about sort of race men and race women, and so this essentialized notion of black identity. So you know it when you see it because it walks a certain way, it talks a certain way, it looks a certain way. And so there's these ties to the historically and what's deemed culturally relevant organizations, people, and concepts. But in addition to that, there's these ideas that there have to be overt. There have to be overt actions, not covert actions. You know, you have to be able to validate it. And I'm going to talk about credentialing in a second. My focus is on racial authenticity and sort of the externalities of racial authenticity, how racial authenticity can be used by whites to disadvantage blacks. And so we'll get to that. And so who is racially authentic? And so racial authenticity is usually sort of what Adolph Reed calls corporate racial interests, or what philosopher Kwame Appiah calls scripts, just like a play where there's a script that we have to conform to. And so, you know, you have this use of racial language to frame discussions on place, space, and opportunity. So it provides, it's an analytic device. And so sort of this is, you come out this work with Lonnie Grenier and her discussion of the miner's canary. All right, it's analytic. When you know that the mine shaft is sort of deteriorating, then you cry as a canary, and that sends a signal. But it's also a diagnostic device. It's a sort of a political and discursive strategy which testifies and sanctifies the essentialism by anchoring politics to a race-based agitation against adverse socioeconomic environments. And so what I argue is the conceptual linchpin in how to maximize the representation of black interests is racial authenticity. It has a long history in black historical memory in electoral politics. So just, you know, give you some examples. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois's attack on Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey's attack on Du Bois, Malcolm X's fiery critique against moral suasion, and Martin Luther King Jr., confrontations within and between black nationalists before, after, and during the Gary Convention of 1972, rebukes of black feminists and womanists as race traitors by these same black nationalists, criticisms of black Republicans aligned with or inspired by Ronald Reagan. I showed you the Emerge magazine, and then eventually discussions within black politics about who is a black scholar if they're writing certain things. So we get to the contextual problem, and I have the contextual problem on the screen. Reagan is the contextual problem. Because he redefined this sort of debate about what leadership was by connecting what we didn't see. You know, he connected federalism, states' rights, race, in sort of this way that made people re-examine the relationship between government and particular interest groups. And so, you know, as Haynes Walton and Ron Walters have both written, that, you know, Ronald Reagan sort of changed the debate. It affected the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And that's why you see both of them sort of, you know, tipping their hat to Reagan. So new black electoral leadership that wants a shift in the paradigm, a shift in the concept of who is racially authentic, and a discussion on winning versus leverage. Do you want to win or do you want to leverage? And sometimes there are different strategies based upon your goals. If you want to win, you might go all out and you might compromise. If you want to leverage, you might be more strategic. And so leadership is tied to these sort of tangible benefits. And as I argue, because tangible benefits are usually tied to the land, we always talk about the adverse socioeconomic condition. The adverse socioeconomic condition is sort of like tagged, you know, on our forehead. So black politics is connected to sort of these material conditions. But then we have to ask ourselves, do we want to privilege an ethics of identity privileging race, or racialization, or an ethics of identity privileging humanity? So the challenge, navigating old wine in new bottles. The goals differ across individuals. Some individuals, because they have the hue, the pigmentation, do not mean they have the view. All legislative environments are not the same. And so that was my first book. I didn't bring it, Ron, but Devolution in Black State Legislators, where we sort of talked about how you have very big caucuses in some states, but they don't have any power. And the reality is they don't have any power because the structure of the committee system, the structure of the environment that they work in, prevents them from, passing policies of substance. So they can get in and yell and scream all they want, but if they're not on the committee, then they can't have power. And then if they're on the committee, I'm very strategic. What I can do is I can house black legislators on the committee and then rewrite the rules so the committee they're on doesn't get any real legislation. And that's what we showed looking at 30 states. All campaign environments are not the same. Problems and inequality still persist. So the questions are raised. Are the strategies different? And then the normative questions, should the strategies differ? And so this is some data from the Joint Center that looked at sort of BEOs based on generation. So what you see is that, the first one is 65 and older, and then the last one is 18 to 40. So they asked the question, did you attend a historically black college? And you see the differences. And then they asked, are you active in the civil rights movement? However, that's sort of defined. And so you see only 9% of those BEOs, those black elected officials from 18 to 40 say they are. So the idea is that your time, place, and space affects your politics. So then a changing of the guard or a new BEO strategy. So voucher support, which is a hot issue for many African Americans. You see 18 to 40, they're more likely to support vouchers. 18 to 40, they're more likely, to consider themselves sort of moderate. And then in civil rights organizations, where they are. So during the Q&A, we can talk about this wonderful conference that was in Destin in 2005, called by the NAACP to sort of reconstruct this sort of civil rights agenda, given these sort of changing demographics and the way generations think. So deracialization might be the answer to Reagan. Might be the answer, because it seems like in the study of black politics and in just sort of the practice of black politics, whoever they may be, beat us to the punch. There's always sort of a rhetorical construction of these ideas that mobilize the base, and then we have to respond. So I want to sort of unpack this notion of deracialization, conducting a campaign by avoiding explicit reference to race-specific issues and be racially transcendent, et cetera, et cetera. And so supporters of deracialization have said the goals must be within the black politics framework. And so, I'm sort of critical of how we study black politics and how we practice black politics, because it's legitimate if it's done for the express purpose of improving the material conditions of African Americans in a way that is sensitive to the historical role and continuing impact of white racism in American political life. So what that means usually is that actors must be within their black politics framework. They must be Democrats. But Ron Walter's colleague, our colleague, Robert Smith said, the new politics of deracialization is not likely to be able to arrest and reverse the decline of the black community. And Robert said in its strategic calculus, sort of these deracialization, that even black leadership itself may be turning away from the problem. So in this sort of classic volume in 1993, Georgia Person basically says Gary Franks is not black politics because of his constituency. And so that allows these coded messages about race and racial interests. How do we define racial interests? And so I like this song, Whitney Houston. I like it. How will I know? How will I know that he really loves me? And then the girl said, don't trust your feelings. And then it says, how will I know? How will I know? Love can be deceiving. How will I know if he really loves me? And if you remember the video, there's this sort of shadow of Aretha Franklin, so, the sort of godmother of soul. And so Whitney Houston is appealing to some empirical and cultural validation that this individual loves them, and at the same time asking for sort of legitimacy of this validation. And that's difficult. And so these competitive frames about Kwesi Mfume, Ben Carter, Michael Steele, I'll just get to the punchline. The punchline is this. Maryland is a Democratic state. Okay? So everyone said that when Sarbanes said he was going to step down, when he won and made history in 2000 for a fifth term, everyone said, oh, Senate race leans Democrat. Okay, but this race in 2006 was actually 4 years in the making. Because in 2002, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend did not pick a black running mate. And it made African Americans very upset. So Robert Ehrlich picked Michael Steele, who was the first elected Republican state chair. And that elected is important because others have been chairs, but they have not been elected. They've been appointed, but he was elected. So, you know, people saw this as an opportunity. And Mfume basically said if the Democrats were serious about race and representation, they would clear the field. All right, so I have to put the dates there so you sort of get the picture. So Mfume announces in March 2005, it's time for the Democratic Party to make a bold statement in a blue state where blacks have always been willing to support white Democrats for office. If not, there could be a seismic change. So according to some people from the Washington Post, the Democrats went and tried to find someone more respectable than Kwesi, and Ben Carton announces in April 2005. So Steele announces in October 2005, and he sort of uses race, ideology, and authenticity, talking about the new civil rights struggle. Not to just sit at the diner, but to own the diner and to create legacy wealth for our children. And then he talks about growing up in a segregated city, raised by a single mom. Does this sound familiar? And eventually the first in his family to get a law degree. And then they racialize him. Now, I know if they did this to Barack Obama, individuals would be up in arms. And so the Senate race becomes sort of a toss-up. It's no longer sort of Steele is going to lose and Carton's going to win. So the Democratic pollster writes a memo. It says, Governor Ehrlich and Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele have a clear ability to break through the Democratic stronghold among African Americans in Maryland. Democrats must be aggressive. Steele is a unique challenge. And that's in March 2006. So it switches to a toss-up. And so here's some of the data where you see Carton is winning. He's got the vote, he's got the public approval, and then all these things start happening, and then you see Steele gaining. And the undecided are switching. And the primary is September 12th, 2006. So yeah, Carton wins, we know, but the story is about how. So Steele runs to race by trying to capitalize on independence. People called him Uncle Tom, whites called him Uncle Tom. No blacks protested, no blacks rallied, but white elected officials called him an Uncle Tom. Steny Hoyer said that he slavishly followed the Bush administration. And so, you know, Russell Simmons campaigned for him, and let me see if I can play this.
What's up, y'all? It's Russell Simmons. Today I'm coming to you to ask you to vote for my good friend Michael Steele to become the next senator from Maryland. 4 years ago, I came here to campaign against the lieutenant governor. Today, I come here to stand beside him. I trust him because he's lived up to every commitment he made our communities. He's increased the state contract for minority business by more than a third. He's reduced recidivism among ex-offenders. He went against the grain and gave people drug treatment rather than prison. I trust the lieutenant governor. Michael Steele knows the issues that affect us because he comes from our struggle. For too long, our voice has been ignored in Washington. Michael Steele could change that. Let's go to work now and change the game. Go to the polls and vote for Michael Steele for United States Senator. Make sure you empower yourself on Tuesday, November 7th. Vote.
I'm Michael Steele, candidate for the United States Senate, and I approve this message.
And so, change the game for those younger individuals or into hip-hop, sort of change the game was sort of popularized by Jay-Z, and Jay-Z did throw Michael Steele parties, fundraising events. So that's something that's really not talked about. It's usually, you know, hip-hop and the Democrats, but there's something else there. He said, they're afraid of what I represent. They're afraid of the fact that African-American voters have options, and I'm one of them. He always used these colloquialisms. I'm not trying to diss the president. I'm just trying to distance myself from the president. I'm trying to show lines where I have a different perspective. And so Kathy Hughes endorsed Michael Steele. So sort of run to race and economic power. And then Steele tried to do this sort of Reagan Democrat, Steele Democrat thing. Democrats said it was partisan identity theft, where Steele was trying to market himself as a different person. Just the way we have the lexicon Reagan Democrats, individuals who voted for Reagan because they didn't like the Democrat, but they didn't want to switch their party to vote for Reagan. That's what Steele was talking about. And so then Steele runs on black discontent. So he gets this endorsement from what you can see these County Executive Wayne Curry, Councilman Camille Exum, Councilman Sam Dean, and Ron Walters. When this was released, Ron Walters called this move audacious, that individuals would be talking about it, quote, across the country, this sort of endorsement by these black Democrats of Michael Steele. Make the dream a reality. Obviously, the dream is still MLK. And many black Democrats were upset that the Democratic establishment sort of endorsed or, anointed Cardin before even the primary. So they were really upset about it. And I'm going to show you how Kwesi Mfume plays into that. So this is the pre-election unity rally after Kwesi loses, and he says, quote, "We need women in leadership positions in the state. We've got to find a way that African Americans and other minorities are represented statewide in office." Now that is interesting, given that now Lieutenant Governor Brown was on the ticket. So Kwesi is talking about the Democrats need to do something at the same time that there's an individual who's on the Lieutenant Governor ballot. And so State Senator Nathaniel Exum says they don't take us serious. We're the most loyal constituency and they don't take us serious. They have never done anything and they pay us lip service. We have to see how it plays out. We know how it plays out. Kwesi lost. But Steele bounced on it and said the challenge of opportunity is to build a bridge to communities the Democratic Party has taken for granted. And he basically says you don't have to wait any longer. So Steele runs to Black Power. This is a very controversial voter guide. Notice the colors, red, black, and green, basically saying this is a sample ballot distributed to Prince County precincts. Democrats are outraged. Voters reject Steele. So this is sort of what you see based upon the racial percentage of blacks in that precinct. They were more likely to not vote for Steele. But the question is, should we go black to the future? I mean black to the future, going back to Baynard Rustin's notion of building coalitions, sort of getting beyond race, because then race as a trope allows individuals to construct legislation and committees against us, and then we say we are descriptively represented. I mean, I could put 1,000 African Americans in the room, and then if you only have one vote, you're here, but you're not representing really. So transformations take time. Do we have it? How politicians and people come to talk about and understand the benefits of black political identity can change at the margins. And, there's the things are historic and problematic in retrospect. So when Reagan was running for office, people really basically ignored him, and they said, well, he's just this actor. In retrospect, we know he damaged the country in some regard. When Brown versus Board of Education, and this is Lonnie Grenier saying, when Brown versus Board of Education was being argued, the whole rhetorical construction was black children are disadvantaged by segregated environments, and they should be integrated. Well, individuals like Derek Bell argued a different thing, and now we know, because of the Louisville and Seattle case, they said, well, you can't do desegregation anymore. So how you lay this foundation will impact the future. Racial redistricting, we knew we lost Democratic seats. And then interestingly enough, signing statements. During the Iran-Contra sort of hearing, Dick Cheney co-authored a minority report for the House, arguing that basically the president can ignore the will of Congress through signing statements. And people ignored that, but it became the foundation for what President Bush has been doing. So, black to the future, I don't want to play the sort of Boondocks, the Return of the King, but I put them up there. But I will play this radio ad, and then I'll end. You see there the sort of iconography of Martin Luther King Jr. and yeah, that's the thing, but it's Obama.
Dr. King was a real man.
You know he was a Republican.
Dr. King, a Republican?
Democrats passed those black codes and Jim Crow laws. Democrats started the Ku Klux Klan.
White hoods and sheets?
Democrats fought all civil rights legislation from the 1860s to the 1960s. Democrats released those vicious dogs and fire hoses on blacks.
Seriously?
And the Dixiecrats remained Democrats and vowed to vote for a yellow dog before a Republican. Republicans freed us from slavery and put our right to vote in the Constitution.
What?
Republicans started the NAACP, Affirmative Action, and the HBCUs.
Sounds like Democrats have bamboozled blacks.
Democrats blocked the minimum wage passed by Republicans, and over $200 billion have been spent on education, health care, and job training since President Bush took office.
So Democrats want to keep us poor while voting only Democrat.
Democrats want us to accept same-sex marriages, teen abortions without a parent's consent, and suing the Boy Scouts for saying God in their pledge.
See, we need to think and vote on our own values.
Exactly. Democrats have talked the talk, but the Republicans have walked the walk.
Girl, it's time for us to do the walk.
You know it, girl.
So my argument, very comical. My argument is simply that African American politics needs to look beyond the next election cycle. Needs to look beyond these sort of icons that are constructed right now in order for black politics to get back to the foundation of black politics, which Ron articulated, which is freedom. And freedom can come in many forms. Thank you.